Hey friends, pull up a chair around the campfire. It's time to talk about the beautiful sculptures that wind can make with sand. For those who know the Greek mythology, I'm guessing you can assume that when we're talking about aeolian dunes, we're talking about wind-blown ones, as Aeolus is the Greek god of wind. When I used to imagine desert dune fields, images of camels and those crescent moon-shaped piles of sand in the Saharan desert came to mind. And while the Sahara is certainly a gorgeous example of a dune field, at least for me, there are also some excellent, if smaller, examples closer to home. I remember the first dunes that I saw were in Death Valley. From a distance, they look like a splotch of lighter colored material with soft peaks. And when you get closer, they continue to look like a splotch of lighter colored material with soft peaks. I went to Death Valley back in January, and trust me, the winter is definitely the best time to go, because that's when the sand is thankfully non-skin melting temperatures. Short aside on that, sand heats up so quickly because it has a low specific heat. And specific heat is how much energy it requires to heat a substance. Specific heat is a pretty good identifier of where you have sand. In fact, one of the constraints for the landing site of the Mars 2020 Perseverance rover was that the thermal inertia had to be below a certain threshold, and thermal inertia is a function of specific heat. So a lower specific heat would result in a low thermal inertia. So by constraining the thermal inertia of the landing site, that meant that the rover didn't just plop into a pile of deep sand and have difficulty waddling its way out. So yes, Death Valley, January, best time. Because when you see dunes, the first thing that you want to do is take your hiking boots off and go wiggle your toes in the sand. So, obviously, did that first. And then, after that very necessary frolicking was out of the way, I turned my attention to actually looking at the dunes. These were not the dunes that I had imagined. There were no camels to be found anywhere. But on a more serious note, not all of them were that crescent moon shape that I grew up thinking dunes were. You know the one. This one. These are technically called Barkhan dunes. They're one of 6 different dune types, and which dune type is formed is based on 2 different things: wind and sand. Alright, I know. Of course dunes are formed by wind and sand. Thanks, Emily. Super helpful. So, more specifically, the type of dune that will form is based on how many directions the wind is blowing and how much sand is available. Barkhan dunes, we've got that covered. Those are those Pillsbury crescent rolls shaped dunes. They form when the wind is blowing in from one direction, or unidirectional wind regime, and when there's a limited amount of sand. When you turn that sand dial up, and there's more sand available in the area, the arms of the crescent dunes, so the end parts of the crescent roll that always seem to burn when I cook them, those arms merge together into a wavy line, and they form what's called Barkanoid dunes. When you have even more sand available, you've got yourself some stunning transverse dunes, which form more of a linear ridge going across. Now, of course, in real life, the distinctions between those 3 types of dunes, formed by unidirectional wind, aren't always as clear-cut as schematics show, and one dune field can have multiple types of dunes. So let's look at some examples of real dunes. This is a Google Earth image, i.e. a bird's eye view, look at an aerial photo, of a field of Barkhan dunes in the Gobi Desert in Mongolia. You can see the crescent shape. And like I mentioned, dune fields can have multiple different types of dunes. This is a great example, again from the Gobi Desert, of Barkhan dunes on the left, merging into Barkanoid dunes on the right. Now, the Mesquite Sand Dunes in Death Valley National Park in California have some really great Barkanoid dunes. To train your eye into it, try to find the cusps, and that'll show you where the arms of 2 Barkhan dunes merge together. There's a cusp here, and there's a cusp here, and once you train your eye, you can start seeing the wavy lines of the connected dunes. Death Valley is another good example of a dune field that has multiple different types of dunes. As you can see, it also has some really nice transverse dunes. And this is a view of the transition between the transverse dunes on the left, going into the Barkanoid dunes on the right. Now, as you can see, the lines forming the transverse dune crests aren't exactly straight, but they're not so wavy as to be called barkanoid dunes. Hey, nature is imperfect. And I say those imperfections are what make it beautiful. But enough cheese. Moving on to the other 3 types of dunes that require a more complex wind regime. Linear dunes form when wind blows from 2 directions, and the crests of the linear dunes are generally parallel to the dominant wind direction. Here are some really awesome examples of linear dunes in Namibia, shown here from a bird's eye view. And you can see that the distance between the crests is about 2 kilometers apart, and that's pretty typical for linear dunes. So one good way to determine if you're looking at a linear dune or a transverse dune from a bird's eye image is to see the distance between crests. And it's going to be larger for linear dunes, more on the scale of 1 to 3 kilometers, as opposed to for transverse dunes, the distance between crests is going to be more on the scale of 100 meters. Another type of dune are star dunes, which form when the wind just simply can't make up its mind about which direction it wants to blow, and so it blows in multiple directions at once without one dominating direction. And so what happens is the wind is bringing all the sand and dumping it into the same spot where all the vectors of wind converge, and because there's just this constant sand dumping in the same spot, these dunes can become some of the tallest dunes. In fact, the Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado hosts a star dune, which is the tallest sand dune in North America. Now, when I went to that national park and tried hiking up the dunes, oh my goodness, hiking up dunes is a struggle. So I did not make it up to the top of the very aptly named Star Dune, but just saw it from a distance, admired the majesty from afar. Here's a nice bird's eye view of a field of star dunes in the Gobi Desert in China. And zooming in further close up, I mean, they are stars after all, you have to get that glamour shot. Now, the final type of dune is the reverse dune, and this forms when there is a dominant direction of wind that will sometimes reverse itself. Great naming scheme. The result of this reversal of wind is that a wall or a lip forms on the top of the dune as the sand is blown back in the other direction. Here are a couple of really nice examples, this one from Libya, and this one from the Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado. So overall, the main thing to take away from our Campfireside chat is that dunes come in lots of different shapes and sizes. One dune field can have multiple different types of dunes. And then when you pin down what morphology your local friendly dune field has, you'll have a better understanding of the wind regime and the sand availability in the vicinity. Thanks, friends, for joining. Have a good night.